The gentle glow of oil lamps flickers across ancient stone walls as we settle into one of history's most misunderstood stories. Tonight, we journey back 2,000 years to uncover the real Mary Magdalene, a woman whose true identity has been buried beneath centuries of myth and misconception. As your eyelids grow heavy and your breathing slows, let me guide you through the dusty streets of first-century Palestine, where a remarkable woman walked alongside Jesus, witnessed his crucifixion, and became the first person to proclaim his resurrection. But before we begin this peaceful journey into the past, if you find comfort in these biblical bedtime stories, consider giving this video a gentle like and subscribing to join our growing community of believers who find rest in God's Word. Also, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. We're building a family of faith that spans the globe, united in our love for these timeless stories. Now close your eyes and let your mind drift back to a time when the Roman Empire cast its shadow across the Mediterranean world. The year is around 30 AD, and in the small fishing village of Magdala, situated on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, a woman prepares for what will become the most extraordinary chapter of her life. This is Mary, called Magdalene, and her story is far more beautiful and complex than the simplified version many of us learned in Sunday school. Mary Magdalene has been called many things throughout history. Some have portrayed her as a repentant sinner, others as a devoted follower, and still others have woven elaborate tales about her relationship with Jesus. But what does the Bible actually tell us about this remarkable woman? Tonight we'll separate fact from fiction, truth from tradition, as we explore the real Mary Magdalene through the lens of Scripture. The village of Magdala, from which Mary took her name, was no ordinary fishing settlement. Archaeological evidence reveals it was a thriving commercial center, complete with markets, synagogues, and even a harbor that welcomed merchant ships from across the Roman world. The town's name itself means tower in Hebrew, and indeed Magdala stood as a beacon of prosperity along the Galilean coastline. Picture, if you will, the narrow cobblestone streets lined with limestone houses, their flat roofs perfect for drying the day's catch. The air would have been filled with the sounds of commerce, merchants haggling over prices, fishermen calling out their wares, and the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor walls. Children played in the dusty streets while their mothers drew water from the town well, sharing news and gossip in the way that small communities have done for millennia. It was into this world that Mary was born. Though we know little about her early life, the Bible doesn't tell us about her childhood, her family, or her circumstances before she encountered Jesus. What we do know is that she was a woman of some means, able to support Jesus' ministry financially, suggesting she may have been a widow or a woman of independent wealth. This detail alone sets her apart from many women of her time, who were typically dependent on male relatives for their livelihood. The first time we encounter Mary Magdalene in the Gospel accounts, she is already a follower of Jesus. Luke's Gospel tells us simply that Jesus had cast 7 demons from her, but it offers no lurid details about her supposed sinful past. In fact, the Bible never once describes Mary Magdalene as a prostitute or a woman of ill repute, That characterization came much later when Pope Gregory the Great in 591 AD mistakenly conflated Mary Magdalene with other women mentioned in the Gospels. But let's pause for a moment and consider what it meant to be possessed by 7 demons in the ancient world. To the people of Mary's time, demons were understood to be the cause of various physical and mental ailments. 7 demons would have represented complete spiritual oppression, a condition that would have made Mary an outcast in her community. Imagine the isolation she must have felt, the fear in people's eyes when they saw her approaching, the whispered conversations that ceased when she entered a room. Yet when Jesus encountered Mary, he saw not a woman to be feared or shunned, but a human being in need of healing and love. With a word, he freed her from the spiritual bondage that had held her captive. Can you imagine the moment when that darkness lifted? The first clear breath she took as a free woman, the tears of joy that must have streamed down her face as she realized she was finally truly free. This healing was not just physical or spiritual, it was social as well. Jesus' act of compassion restored Mary to her community, gave her back her dignity, and opened the door for her to become one of his most devoted followers. In that moment, her life was transformed from one of suffering and isolation to one of purpose and belonging. The gratitude Mary felt toward Jesus was profound and lasting. She didn't simply thank him and return to her former life. Instead, she chose to follow him, becoming one of a group of women who traveled with Jesus and his disciples throughout Galilee and Judea. This was no small decision for a woman in the 1st century. To leave the safety and familiarity of home, to travel with a group of men who were not her relatives, to support a teacher whose message was controversial. These choices required tremendous courage and faith. Luke's Gospel specifically mentions that Mary Magdalene, along with other women, provided for Jesus and his disciples out of their own resources. This detail reveals several important things about Mary. First, as mentioned earlier, she had financial means. Second, she was generous with those resources, using her wealth to support what she believed was God's work. Third, she was committed to Jesus' ministry not just emotionally or spiritually, but practically as well. The women who followed Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, were not passive observers. They were active participants in his ministry, providing the practical support that made it possible for Jesus and his disciples to travel and preach. They prepared meals, arranged lodging, managed finances, and created the domestic infrastructure that allowed the group to function. In many ways, they were the unsung heroes of Jesus' ministry, working behind the scenes to ensure that the good news could be shared with as many people as possible. As we drift deeper into this ancient story, picture Mary walking along the dusty roads of Palestine, her sandals worn from miles of travel, her cloak providing protection from the desert sun. She listens intently as Jesus teaches the crowds, her heart stirring with each parable, each word of wisdom. She watches as he heals the sick, feeds the hungry, and offers hope to the hopeless. She sees in him not just the man who freed her from her demons, but the long-awaited Messiah, the one who would bring salvation to Israel and to the world. The bond between Mary and Jesus was profound, built on gratitude, faith, and mutual respect. In a society where women were often marginalized and their voices dismissed, Jesus treated Mary and the other women followers with dignity and equality. He listened to their concerns, valued their insights, and included them in his inner circle in ways that shocked the religious establishment of his day. Mary's devotion to Jesus was tested as his ministry progressed and opposition to his message grew. The religious leaders of the day viewed Jesus as a threat to their authority and began plotting against him. The Roman authorities saw him as a potential revolutionary who might incite rebellion. Even some of Jesus' own followers began to question whether he was truly the Messiah they had hoped for. Through it all, Mary remained steadfast. When others doubted, she believed. When others abandoned Jesus, she stayed close. Her faith was not shaken by opposition or persecution. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger in the face of adversity. She had experienced firsthand the power of Jesus' love and compassion, and nothing could convince her that he was anything less than the Son of God. As we continue our journey through Mary's story, we begin to see the events that would lead to the most significant weekend in human history. The crowds that once welcomed Jesus with palm branches would soon be crying for his crucifixion. The disciples who had promised to stand by him would scatter in fear. But Mary Magdalene, along with a small group of faithful women, would remain at his side through the darkest hours. The peaceful rhythm of your breathing matches the gentle pace of our story as we prepare to witness Mary's greatest test of faith. In the days ahead, she would watch the man who had given her new life suffer and die on a Roman cross. She would experience the depths of grief and despair, wondering if everything she had believed had been a lie. But she would also become the first person to witness the greatest miracle in human history, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Tonight, as you rest in the comfort of your bed, remember Mary Magdalene's example of unwavering faith and devotion. Remember that Jesus sees beyond our brokenness to our potential, beyond our past to our future. Remember that no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn of hope is always approaching. Let Mary's story remind you that God can use anyone, regardless of their past or their circumstances, to play a crucial role in his divine plan. The woman who was once possessed by 7 demons became the first evangelist, the first person to proclaim the good news of Jesus' resurrection. Her transformation from outcast to apostle is a testament to the power of God's love and grace. As sleep begins to claim you, carry with you the image of Mary Magdalene, a woman of courage, faith, and devotion. Her story is far from over, and in the days to come we will witness her finest hour, the moment when she would earn the title Apostle to the Apostles. But for now, rest in the peace of knowing that you are loved and valued by the same God who transformed Mary's life and can transform yours as well. The soft whisper of wind through olive groves carries us forward in time, to the days when Mary Magdalene walked closely beside Jesus, witnessing miracles that would echo through eternity. As your body sinks deeper into peaceful rest, let your spirit journey with us to those sacred moments when the extraordinary became ordinary, and the impossible became possible. Mary's days were filled with wonder and purpose. Each morning brought new teachings, new healings, new demonstrations of divine love that challenged everything the religious establishment held dear. She watched Jesus touch the untouchable, heal the incurable, and speak words that penetrated the hardest hearts. The woman who had once been bound by spiritual darkness now lived in the brilliant light of God's presence, and she treasured every moment. Picture Mary sitting on a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee, listening as Jesus taught the crowds about the kingdom of heaven. His voice carried across the water, gentle yet authoritative, filled with wisdom that seemed to come from eternity itself. The parables he shared painted pictures of God's love in language that common people could understand. Seeds scattered on different types of soil, a shepherd searching for one lost sheep, a woman rejoicing over a found coin. These simple stories revealed profound truths about the nature of divine love. Mary absorbed every word, every gesture, every expression that crossed Jesus' face. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his emotions, to sense when he was moved by compassion or grieved by unbelief. She saw the way his eyes filled with tears when he looked upon Jerusalem, knowing the suffering that awaited its people. She witnessed the joy that lit up his face when children ran to him, their innocent faith a stark contrast to the skepticism of the adults around them. The other women in Jesus' inner circle became Mary's dearest friends and companions. There was Joanna, the wife of Chuza, who managed Herod's household but had left her comfortable life to follow Jesus. Her presence in the group was particularly significant, as it showed that Jesus' message reached even into the highest levels of society. Then there was Susanna, about whom the scriptures tell us little, but whose faithful presence speaks volumes about her character and devotion. These women formed a tight-knit community within the larger group of disciples. They shared meals together, prayed together, and supported one another through the challenges of their unconventional lifestyle. They were bound not just by their common faith, but by their shared understanding of what it meant to be women in a male-dominated world who had found freedom and purpose in following Jesus. Mary often found herself serving as a bridge between Jesus and those who sought his help. Women who were too afraid or too ashamed to approach him directly would come to Mary first, knowing she would understand their struggles and their pain. She had, after all, been where they were, broken, hopeless, desperate for healing. Her own transformation gave her a unique ability to offer comfort and encouragement to others who were suffering. The religious leaders of the day found Mary's presence deeply troubling. A woman who had once been possessed by demons was now walking freely among them, treated with respect and dignity by Jesus. This challenged their understanding of purity laws and social hierarchies. They whispered among themselves about the impropriety of Jesus allowing such women to follow him, not understanding that this was precisely the point, that God's grace extended to all people regardless of their past or their social status. Mary's financial contributions to Jesus' ministry were substantial and consistent. She had likely liquidated property or investments in Magdala to support the group's needs. This wasn't a one-time gift given in gratitude for her healing, but an ongoing commitment that demonstrated her complete dedication to Jesus' mission. Her generosity enabled the group to focus on preaching and teaching rather than worrying about their daily bread. The intimacy of life in Jesus' traveling community meant that Mary witnessed moments of profound spiritual significance that were never recorded in the Gospels. She saw him rise early in the morning to pray, his face radiant with communion with his Father. She observed his interactions with the 12 apostles, sometimes patient and gentle, other times challenging and corrective. She noticed how he adapted his teaching style to different audiences, speaking to scholars differently than he spoke to children, yet always with the same underlying message of love and redemption. Mary's presence during Jesus' healing miracles gave her a unique perspective on his divine power. She watched him restore sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, and mobility to the paralyzed. She saw him cast out demons with a word, knowing intimately the freedom that such deliverance brought. She witnessed him raise the dead, including her friend Lazarus, and marveled at the power of the God who could command even death itself. The opposition to Jesus' ministry grew stronger as time passed, and Mary could sense the increasing tension in the air. The religious leaders' questions became more pointed, their traps more elaborate. The crowds that once followed Jesus with enthusiasm began to thin as his teachings challenged their preconceptions and demanded real change in their lives. Even some of his disciples began to murmur among themselves, questioning whether this was truly the Messiah they had been expecting. Through it all, Mary remained steadfast in her faith. She had seen too much, experienced too much to be swayed by doubt or discouragement. When others questioned Jesus' identity, she remembered the moment he had freed her from her demons. When others criticized his association with tax collectors and sinners, she recalled how he had treated her with dignity when others had shunned her. When others wondered about his power, she had witnessed firsthand the miracles that flowed from his compassionate heart. As Jesus began to speak more frequently about his impending death, Mary felt a chill of foreboding that no amount of faith could entirely dispel. The man who had become the center of her world, the source of her purpose and joy, was speaking of betrayal and crucifixion. The other disciples often dismissed these predictions, unable to reconcile them with their expectations of a conquering Messiah. But Mary listened with growing concern, her woman's intuition telling her that dark days lay ahead. The final journey to Jerusalem filled Mary with conflicting emotions. She was excited to see Jesus receive the recognition he deserved in the holy city, but she was also apprehensive about the reception he might receive from the religious authorities there. Jerusalem was the stronghold of the very people who had been plotting against him, and she knew that walking into their territory would be dangerous. Yet Mary's love for Jesus compelled her to follow him wherever he led, even if it meant walking into danger. She had already given up everything to be part of his ministry. Her home, her former life, her security. Now she would give up her safety as well, staying by his side as he faced the greatest trial of his earthly life. The atmosphere in Jerusalem during Passover was electric with anticipation and tension. Thousands of pilgrims had come to the city to celebrate the feast, and rumors about Jesus spread like wildfire through the crowded streets. Some proclaimed him as the promised Messiah, while others dismissed him as a false prophet. The religious leaders watched nervously as crowds gathered to hear him teach, their fear of losing control growing with each passing day. Mary walked through the temple courts with Jesus, watching as he overturned the tables of the money changers and drove out those who had turned his Father's house into a marketplace. She saw the righteous anger in his eyes, the divine authority with which he acted, and she understood that this was a pivotal moment in his ministry. The lines were being drawn, and there would be no turning back. In the quiet moments between public appearances, Mary treasured the conversation she had with Jesus. He spoke to her and the other women with a tenderness that revealed his deep appreciation for their loyalty and sacrifice. He acknowledged the unique challenges they faced as women in a patriarchal society. Yet he never treated them as inferior or less capable than their male counterparts. In Jesus' presence, Mary experienced a preview of the kingdom of heaven, where all would be equal in the eyes of God. As we draw closer to the climax of Mary's story, feel your breathing slow and your muscles relax. The peaceful darkness of night surrounds you like a gentle embrace, just as God's love surrounded Mary during her darkest hours. Tomorrow's worries can wait. Tonight you rest in the assurance that you are held in the same loving hands that guided Mary Magdalene through her extraordinary journey. The woman who had once been tormented by 7 demons was about to face the greatest test of her faith. But she would not face it alone. The same God who had delivered her from spiritual bondage would sustain her through the trials ahead, preparing her for a role that would make her one of the most important figures in Christian history. Sleep now, knowing that your own story is being written by the same loving God who transformed Mary's life and used her in ways she could never have imagined. The cool evening breeze carries the scent of burning incense through the narrow streets of Jerusalem as Mary Magdalene prepares for what will become the most sacred meal in human history. Your eyelids grow heavy as we witness these final precious moments before everything changes, before the world tilts on its axis and nothing remains the same. Mary moves through the upper room with quiet purpose, her hands steady despite the weight of anticipation that fills the air. She can sense something profound approaching, though she cannot yet name it. The other women work alongside her, preparing the Passover feast that will become so much more than any of them could imagine. The lamb has been slaughtered, the bitter herbs prepared, the wine poured into simple clay cups that will hold the most precious blood ever shed. Picture Mary's gentle movements as she spreads the cloth upon the low table, her fingers smoothing the rough linen with the same care she has shown throughout her journey with Jesus. The room fills with the warm glow of oil lamps, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The 12 apostles enter quietly, their faces grave with the knowledge that their master has been speaking more frequently of his approaching death. Jesus arrives last, his presence immediately transforming the atmosphere in the room. Mary watches as he surveys the prepared meal, his eyes meeting hers with a look of profound gratitude. In that moment, she understands that he sees not just the physical preparations, but the love and devotion that have gone into every detail. The bread she has broken, the wine she has poured, the space she has prepared. All of it becomes sacred in his presence. As they recline around the table, Mary positions herself where she can observe Jesus' face. Treasuring every expression, every word, she has learned to read the subtle changes in his countenance. And tonight she sees something that makes her heart ache, a sorrow so deep it seems to touch the very foundations of the earth. Yet beneath that sorrow she glimpses something else, a determination, a resolve that speaks of purposes beyond human understanding. The familiar words of the Passover ritual take on new meaning as Jesus speaks them. When he lifts the bread and gives thanks, Mary notices how his hands tremble slightly, not from fear but from the weight of what he is about to do. "This is my body," he says, and though the disciples exchange confused glances, Mary feels the truth of those words settle into her spirit like seeds falling into fertile soil. The wine becomes something entirely new when Jesus lifts the cup. Mary watches as he holds it before them, the dark liquid catching the lamplight like liquid jewels. "This is my blood of the covenant," he declares, "which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The words hang in the air like a prayer, like a promise, like a prophecy about to be fulfilled. Mary's throat tightens as she realizes what Jesus is telling them. This meal is not just a remembrance of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. It is a foreshadowing of a greater deliverance to come. The blood of the Passover lamb that had protected the firstborn of Israel was merely a shadow of the blood that would soon protect all who believe. Her heart breaks and soars simultaneously as she grasps the magnitude of what is unfolding before her eyes. The conversation around the table grows somber as Jesus speaks of betrayal. Mary watches Judas Iscariot, noting the way his eyes avoid Jesus' gaze, the tension in his shoulders, the restless movement of his hands. She has always sensed something different about him, a darkness that seems to resist the light that Jesus brings. When he leaves the room claiming to run an errand, Mary feels a chill that has nothing to do with the evening air. Jesus begins to wash the disciples' feet, and Mary's heart nearly breaks as she watches the Creator of the universe kneel before his created beings, serving them with the humility of a household slave. When Peter protests, Jesus' response reveals the depth of his mission. "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Mary understands that this act of service is not merely symbolic but prophetic, a demonstration of the cleansing that his death will provide. The teachings Jesus shares that evening penetrate Mary's soul like arrows of light. He speaks of love as the greatest commandment, of laying down one's life for one's friends, of the promise of the Holy Spirit who will comfort and guide them after he is gone. Each word is a treasure that Mary stores in her heart, knowing she will need these promises in the dark days ahead. As the evening progresses, Mary notices Jesus' growing agitation. He speaks of his departure, of going to prepare a place for them, of coming again to receive them unto himself. The disciples ask questions that reveal their confusion, but Mary listens with the understanding that comes from deep intimacy with the speaker. She knows that Jesus is trying to prepare them for something that will shatter their world before it remakes it. The moment arrives when Jesus announces that one of them will betray him. The shock that ripples through the room is palpable, but Mary has been expecting this. She has seen the signs, felt the spiritual darkness gathering like storm clouds. When Jesus identifies Judas as the betrayer, she watches the man's face transform, love and light fleeing as darkness takes full possession. After Judas departs, Jesus speaks with even greater urgency about his impending glorification. Mary recognizes this as the language of the cross, though she cannot yet fully comprehend how death could bring glory. She trusts in Jesus' words even when they seem to contradict everything she thinks she knows about victory and triumph. The new commandment Jesus gives them that night becomes etched in Mary's memory. Love one another as I have loved you. She realizes that this is not merely a suggestion but a mandate, a way of life that will distinguish his followers from all others. The love she has received from Jesus must now flow through her to touch others who are broken and hurting, just as she once was. Jesus' prayer for his disciples, spoken aloud in their presence, moves Mary to tears. She hears him asking the Father to protect them, to sanctify them, to keep them unified in love. But most remarkably, she hears him pray not only for those present, but for all who will believe through their testimony. In that moment, she glimpses the vast scope of God's plan stretching across centuries and continents, touching lives not yet born. As they prepare to leave the upper room, Mary helps gather the remnants of the meal. But she knows she is handling sacred things. The breadcrumbs, the wine stains, the very air they have breathed. All have been transformed by Jesus' presence and words. She understands that this room will forever hold the memory of the night when heaven touched earth in the most intimate way. The walk to the Garden of Gethsemane is shrouded in an otherworldly atmosphere. Mary and the other women follow at a distance, their hearts heavy with foreboding. The moon hangs low in the sky, casting eerie shadows through the olive trees. The very air seems to whisper of approaching darkness, of cosmic forces gathering for the ultimate confrontation between light and darkness. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John deeper into the garden, but Mary can hear his anguished prayers from where she waits. The sound of his weeping pierces her heart like a sword. She has never heard such raw emotion from him, such human vulnerability. Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, he cries, and Mary realizes that even the Son of God struggles with the weight of his calling. The agony in the garden reveals to Mary the true cost of redemption. Jesus is not approaching his death with stoic resignation, but with the full awareness of what it will mean. The physical pain, the spiritual separation from his Father, the weight of humanity's sin pressing down upon his sinless soul. Yet through it all, she hears his ultimate surrender. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. The sound of approaching footsteps and voices breaks the sacred silence of the garden. Mary's blood runs cold as she sees the flickering light of torches through the trees, accompanied by the glint of weapons. Judas leads the way, his face a mask of determination and shame. The betrayer's kiss, that most intimate gesture of affection, becomes the signal for Jesus' arrest. Mary watches in horror as rough hands seize Jesus as the disciples scatter like frightened sheep. The man who had commanded storms and raised the dead allows himself to be bound and led away like a common criminal. She wants to cry out, to intervene, but something in Jesus' bearing stops her. This is not defeat, but surrender, not weakness, but strength beyond human comprehension. The night that began with such sacred intimacy now dissolves into chaos and fear. Mary's world tilts as she watches Jesus disappear into the darkness, surrounded by soldiers and temple guards. The contrast between the gentle man who had washed feet and spoken of love and the bound prisoner being dragged away is almost too much to bear. Yet even in this darkest hour, Mary does not abandon her Lord. While the male disciples flee to safety, she and the other women follow the arresting party at a distance, their hearts breaking but their loyalty unwavering. They have walked with Jesus through triumph and teaching. Now they will walk with him through trial and tribulation. The woman who had once been possessed by 7 demons now faces the greatest test of her faith. The man who had set her free is now himself bound. The one who had given her life and purpose appears to be walking toward death. Every fiber of her being wants to believe that this is all part of some divine plan, but the evidence of her senses suggests otherwise. As dawn approaches, Mary finds herself in the courtyard of the high priest's house, warming her hands over a small fire while Jesus faces his accusers inside. The sound of mocking laughter drifts from the windows, followed by the sickening sound of blows being struck. Each sound is a dagger to her heart, yet she remains bearing witness to the suffering of the one she loves. The rooster crows 3 times, and Mary sees Peter emerge from the shadows, his face streaked with tears of shame and regret. She understands immediately what has happened. The bold fisherman who had promised to die for Jesus has denied even knowing him. The realization that even the closest disciples can fail in their darkest hour fills her with both sorrow and determination to remain faithful no matter what comes. As the eastern sky begins to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Mary prepares herself for what she knows will be the most difficult day of her life. The man who had transformed her from a woman possessed by demons into a beloved disciple is about to face the ultimate test, and she will not leave him to face it alone. The gentle rhythm of your breathing matches the quiet desperation of Mary's vigil as she waits through the long night. Sleep comes easily now, knowing that even in the darkest hours, love remains steadfast. Tomorrow will bring trials that will test every fiber of faith, but tonight rest in the knowledge that some bonds are stronger than death itself, and some love endures beyond the grave. The pre-dawn darkness wraps around Jerusalem like a burial shroud as Mary Magdalene keeps her lonely vigil outside the high priest's house. Your breathing has found its peaceful rhythm now, matching the quiet desperation that fills her heart as she waits through these endless hours before the most tragic day in human history. The cold stone beneath her feet seems to echo with the footsteps of those who have come to witness Jesus' trial. Mary pulls her cloak tighter around her shoulders, not just against the morning chill, but against the growing realization that everything she has known and loved is about to be torn away. The woman who had once lived in spiritual darkness now faces a darkness of the soul that threatens to consume her very being. Through the narrow windows of the high priest's house, she can hear the voices of the religious leaders, their accusations flying like arrows aimed at the heart of the man who had shown her nothing but love and compassion. Each word of false testimony cuts through her like a blade, and she finds herself whispering prayers for strength, for mercy, for some divine intervention that might yet save her beloved teacher. The other women gather around her in the courtyard, their faces etched with the same anguish that tears at Mary's heart. They have all left everything to follow Jesus, and now they watch helplessly as the world they have known crumbles around them. Joanna weeps silently, remembering how Jesus had healed her of her infirmities. Susanna clutches her cloak with trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the door through which Jesus had been dragged hours ago. Mary thinks of all the mornings she had awakened to find Jesus already deep in prayer, his face radiant with communion with his Father. She remembers the gentle way he had spoken to children, the compassion in his eyes when he looked upon the sick and suffering, the authority with which he had commanded the winds and waves. How could such a man be treated as a criminal? How could love itself be put on trial? As the first light of dawn begins to creep across the courtyard, Mary hears the heavy wooden door creak open. Her heart leaps with hope, but it quickly turns to horror as she sees Jesus emerge, his face already bearing the marks of his accuser's cruelty. Blood trickles from where thorns have been pressed into his brow, and his clothes are torn and stained. Yet even in his suffering there is something in his bearing that speaks of dignity unbroken, of love unconquered. The crowd that surrounds Jesus is a mixture of religious leaders, Roman soldiers, and curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle of a public trial. Mary tries to push closer, desperate to catch his eye, to let him know that she is there, that she has not abandoned him. But the press of bodies is too great, and she finds herself swept along with the mob as they make their way toward the fortress of Antonia, where Pontius Pilate holds court. The journey through Jerusalem's narrow streets becomes a nightmare of jeering voices and hostile faces. Mary watches in anguish as people who had once welcomed Jesus with palm branches now call for his blood. The fickleness of human nature is laid bare in the harsh morning light, and she wonders how hearts can change so quickly from love to hatred, from worship to murder. When they reach Pilate's judgment hall, Mary positions herself where she can see the proceedings, though every moment brings fresh agony. She watches as Jesus stands before the Roman governor, his silence more eloquent than any defense could be. Pilate's questions reveal his confusion and growing discomfort with the situation. But Mary knows that political expediency will ultimately triumph over justice. The crowd's chant of "Crucify him" echoes off the stone walls like a death knell. Mary's heart shatters as she realizes that there will be no last-minute reprieve, no divine intervention to spare the man who had given her life meaning and purpose. The God who had parted the Red Sea and raised the dead is allowing his own son to be condemned to the most horrific death imaginable. Pilate's symbolic washing of his hands cannot cleanse the guilt that stains this moment. Mary watches as the Roman soldiers lead Jesus away to be scourged, and she knows that each lash of the whip will tear not just his flesh, but the very fabric of her world. The woman who had once been bound by demons now feels bound by grief so profound it threatens to crush her spirit. The scourging takes place in the courtyard of the Praetorium, hidden from public view but not from the ears of those who love Jesus. The sound of the whip cutting through the air, followed by the wet slap of leather against flesh, creates a rhythm of torture that will haunt Mary's dreams for years to come. She counts each blow, her body flinching with every strike, as if she could somehow absorb his pain into herself. When the soldiers bring Jesus out again, Mary barely recognizes the man who had transformed her life. His back is a mass of torn flesh and flowing blood, his face so swollen and battered that his features are barely visible. The crown of thorns they have pressed upon his head sends rivulets of blood down his cheeks. and the purple robe they have mockingly draped over his shoulders is already stained crimson. The weight of the crossbeam is more than Jesus' tortured body can bear, and Mary watches in horror as he stumbles and falls beneath its weight. The soldiers curse and kick him, demanding that he rise and continue his journey to Golgotha. When they finally compel a passerby named Simon to carry the cross, Mary sees the relief in Jesus' eyes. Though she knows it only delays the inevitable, the procession to Calvary becomes a Via Dolorosa, a way of sorrows that will be remembered for all eternity. Mary follows close behind, her eyes never leaving the stumbling figure of the man who had once walked on water and commanded storms. The other women join her, their tears mixing with the dust of the road as they bear witness to love's ultimate sacrifice. Along the way, Mary notices other women weeping for Jesus, their lamentations rising like incense to heaven. She hears Jesus speak to them even in his agony, telling them not to weep for him but for themselves and their children. His concern for others, even in his darkest hour, only deepens her love and admiration for the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly human. The hill of Golgotha looms before them, its rocky summit already bearing the upright posts of previous crucifixions. Mary's steps become heavier with each stride, knowing that she is walking toward the place where her world will end. The nails that will pierce Jesus' hands and feet might as well pierce her own heart, for she knows that part of her will die with him on that cross. The soldiers' efficiency in the work of crucifixion speaks to their grim experience with this form of execution. Mary forces herself to watch as they strip Jesus of his garments, exposing his wounded body to the mockery of the crowd. The hammer blows that drive the nails through his hands and feet echo across the hillside like thunder, each strike a declaration that love has been defeated, that hope has been crucified. As they raise the cross and drop it into the hole prepared for it, Mary hears Jesus cry out in pain, and she knows that sound will echo in her memory until her dying day. The man who had commanded legions of angels now hangs helpless between heaven and earth, his life ebbing away with each labored breath. The crowd that had gathered to witness his death begins to disperse, their bloodlust satisfied, leaving only a small group of faithful followers to keep vigil. Mary positions herself as close to the cross as the soldiers will allow, her eyes fixed on Jesus' face, trying to memorize every detail before it is too late. Despite his agony, she sees moments of clarity in his eyes, and she knows that he is aware of her presence. The connection between them, forged in the moment of her healing and strengthened through years of faithful discipleship, remains unbroken even by the horror of crucifixion. The hours pass with agonizing slowness, each minute an eternity of suffering. Mary listens as Jesus speaks from the cross, his words of forgiveness for his executioners revealing the depth of his love even in the face of such cruelty. When he commits his mother to John's care, Mary understands that she is witnessing the last acts of a man who continues to love and provide for others even as his own life slips away. The darkness that falls over the land at midday seems to echo the darkness that has settled over Mary's soul. The sun itself appears to mourn the death of its creator, hiding its face from the horror unfolding on Golgotha. In that supernatural darkness, Mary feels the presence of spiritual forces beyond human understanding, as if heaven and hell are locked in cosmic battle over the soul of the man hanging on the cross. Jesus' cry of abandonment, my God, why have you forsaken me?" pierces Mary's heart like a sword. She has never heard such anguish in his voice, such profound loneliness. The man who had always spoken of his intimate relationship with his Father now experiences the ultimate separation, bearing the weight of humanity's sin in his sinless soul. The end comes with startling suddenness. After hours of labored breathing and whispered words, Jesus lifts his head and cries out with a loud voice, "It is finished." The words carry across the hillside with the authority of divine decree, and Mary knows that something cosmic has just been accomplished, though she cannot yet comprehend its full meaning. The moment Jesus breathes his last, the earth itself responds with a violent tremor. The veil of the temple tears from top to bottom, and Mary feels as if the very foundations of the world have shifted. The Roman centurion who had overseen the crucifixion falls to his knees, his face pale with awe and terror. "Truly this was the Son of God," he whispers, and Mary knows that even in death, Jesus continues to touch hearts and change lives. The silence that follows is deafening. Mary stares at the still form hanging on the cross, unable to accept that the man who had given her life meaning and purpose is truly gone. The hands that had touched her in healing now hang lifeless, pierced by nails. The voice that had spoken words of life and hope is forever silenced. The eyes that had looked upon her with such love and compassion are closed in death. Joseph of Arimathea's arrival with permission to take Jesus' body provides a merciful end to the long vigil. Mary watches as he and Nicodemus gently remove the nails and lower Jesus from the cross, wrapping his broken body in fine linen and precious spices. The care they take with his remains speaks to their love and respect for the man who had died as a criminal, but would be buried as a king. The procession to Joseph's tomb is a quiet affair, a stark contrast to the chaos and mockery of the crucifixion. Mary walks behind the men carrying Jesus' body, her heart numb with grief and shock. The tomb, carved from solid rock and sealed with a massive stone, becomes the final resting place for her hopes and dreams. As the stone is rolled into place, Mary feels as if her own life is being sealed away. The man who had freed her from 7 demons is now bound in grave clothes. The one who had given her purpose and identity is now silent in death. The teacher who had shown her the love of God is now hidden behind a stone that might as well be the barrier between earth and heaven. The Sabbath that begins at sundown brings a forced rest that feels like a prison to Mary's grieving heart. She sits in the darkness of her lodging, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what has happened. How could God allow his Son to die such a death? How could love be defeated by hatred? How could the story that had begun with such hope and promise end in such tragedy? As you drift deeper into sleep, feel Mary's grief settle over you like a heavy blanket. The woman who had once danced with joy at her deliverance now weeps in the darkness, her faith shaken to its very foundations. Tomorrow will bring the Sabbath's end and a return to the tomb. But tonight there is only grief, only loss, only the terrible silence of death. Yet even in this darkest hour, Something stirs in the depths of Mary's spirit, a whisper of hope that refuses to be silenced. The God who had delivered her from demons is not finished with his work. The love that had transformed her life is stronger than death itself. And though she cannot yet imagine it, the greatest miracle in human history is only hours away. Sleep now in the peace of knowing that every story of sorrow is moving toward a dawn of joy. Rest in the assurance that love's apparent defeat is only the prelude to its ultimate victory. The stone that seals the tomb will not hold forever, and the woman who weeps tonight will soon become the first herald of the greatest news ever proclaimed to humanity. The first pale light of dawn creeps across the Mount of Olives as Mary Magdalene stirs from her restless sleep. Your own breathing has found its peaceful rhythm now, matching the quiet desperation that still clings to her heart after the most devastating day of her life. The Sabbath has passed in a blur of grief and confusion, each hour stretching like an eternity while she wrestled with questions that had no answers. Mary's eyes are swollen from weeping, her body aching from the emotional toll of watching her beloved teacher die such a horrible death. The woman who had once been tormented by 7 demons now faces a different kind of torment, the agony of loss, the crushing weight of a world that suddenly makes no sense. She rises from her mat, her movements slow and deliberate, like someone walking through a dream that has become a nightmare. The other women are already stirring in the dim light of early morning. Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, moves with the same mechanical precision that has marked all their actions since Friday afternoon. Salome, the mother of James and John, sits in the corner, her face a mask of grief and bewilderment. They have all lost something precious, something that gave their lives meaning and direction. The spices they had prepared for Jesus' burial rest in carefully wrapped bundles beside the door. The myrrh and aloes mixed with precious oils and fragrant herbs represent their final act of love for the man who had transformed their lives. It is a poor substitute for all the words they will never get to speak, all the gratitude they will never get to express. But it is all they have left to offer. Mary's hands shake as she gathers the burial spices, their rich fragrance a bittersweet reminder of happier times. She remembers how Jesus had allowed her to anoint his feet with expensive perfume, how he had defended her actions against the criticism of others. She has done a beautiful thing, he had said, and those words had sustained her through many difficult moments. Now they echo in her memory like a whispered promise that somehow, even in death, beauty can emerge from brokenness. The journey to the tomb takes place in the pre-dawn darkness when the city still sleeps and the guards are drowsy at their posts. Mary and her companions move like shadows through the narrow streets, their footsteps muffled by the dust and their hearts heavy with the weight of their mission. They speak little, each lost in her own thoughts, her own memories of the man they are going to anoint. The garden where Joseph of Arimathea had placed Jesus' body is peaceful in the early morning light. The trees rustle gently in the breeze and the flowers release their fragrance into the cool air. It seems impossible that such a beautiful place could contain such sorrow, that death could intrude upon this sanctuary of growing things. Yet there, carved into the rocky hillside, stands the tomb that has become the focus of all their grief. Mary steps slow as they approach the burial site, her heart hammering against her ribs. The massive stone that had sealed the tomb on Friday evening looms before them, a barrier that seems to mock their intentions. How had they thought they could move such a weight? How had they imagined they could complete the burial preparations that had been left undone in the rush to beat the Sabbath deadline? "Who will roll away the stone for us?" Mary of Bethany whispers, voicing the question that has haunted them all. The stone is not just physically immovable. It represents the finality of death, the impossible barrier between the living and the dead. It stands as a monument to their helplessness, their inability to do anything more for the man they had loved so deeply. But as they draw closer, Mary's steps falter. Something is wrong. The stone, which should be firmly in place, has been moved, not just shifted slightly, but rolled completely away from the entrance to the tomb. The dark opening yawns before them like a mouth, and Mary feels her heart stop beating for a moment. Grave robbers? Roman soldiers? What new horror has befallen their beloved teacher? Mary runs the final distance to the tomb, her companions close behind. The burial spices fall forgotten from her hands as she reaches the entrance and peers into the darkness within. The tomb is empty. The stone slab where Jesus' body had been placed is bare except for the linen wrappings that had been wound around his corpse. The cloths lie there as if the body had simply vanished from within them, leaving only the empty shell of death's cocoon. The sight strikes Mary like a physical blow. First they had taken her Lord's life, and now they had taken his body. Even in death, he was not allowed to rest in peace. The injustice of it fills her with a rage that burns hotter than her grief. She stumbles backward from the tomb, her mind reeling with the implications of what she has discovered. Her companions peer into the empty tomb, their faces reflecting the same shock and confusion that Mary feels. Where is he? Who has done this? Why would anyone desecrate the resting place of a dead man? The questions tumble over each other in Mary's mind, each one more desperate than the last. Mary turns and runs back toward the city, her feet flying over the ground as she races to find Peter and John. They need to know what has happened. They need to see for themselves that Jesus' body is gone. Perhaps they will have answers. Perhaps they will know what to do. The other women follow more slowly, their own shock making them move like sleepwalkers through the garden. The house where the disciples have been hiding is still shuttered and dark when Mary arrives. She pounds on the door, her fist making enough noise to wake the entire neighborhood. When Peter finally opens it, his face haggard with grief and shame, Mary can barely catch her breath enough to speak. "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb," she gasps, her words tumbling over each other in her haste. "We don't know where they have put him." The words sound strange in her own ears, as if someone else is speaking them. The reality of what she has discovered seems too impossible to be true, yet she has seen it with her own eyes. Peter and John exchange glances, and Mary sees something kindle in their eyes. Not quite hope, but something that might grow into hope given time. They push past her and begin running toward the garden, their feet pounding against the stone streets in a rhythm that echoes the beating of Mary's heart. She follows behind them, her breath coming in short gasps, her mind still struggling to process what she has seen. The tomb is exactly as Mary left it when they arrive. Peter enters first, his face grim with determination. John follows, and Mary watches from the entrance as they examine the grave clothes, their expressions growing more puzzled with each passing moment. The wrappings are not scattered as they would be if grave robbers had hastily unwrapped the body. Instead, they lie in perfect order, as if the body had simply dissolved from within them. John's face suddenly changes, and Mary sees something she has not seen since Friday afternoon. A glimmer of belief, a spark of understanding. He whispers something to Peter, too low for Mary to hear, but she sees the older disciples' eyes widen with wonder. They know something, understand something that remains hidden from her. The two men leave the tomb and begin walking back toward the city, their conversation intense and urgent. Mary wants to follow them, to demand answers, but something keeps her rooted to the spot. She cannot leave this place, cannot abandon the last connection she has to the man who had transformed her life. Even if his body is gone, even if she doesn't understand what has happened, she cannot walk away. Mary sinks to her knees beside the tomb, her tears falling like rain onto the dusty ground. The emptiness of the burial chamber seems to echo the emptiness in her heart. Everything she had believed, everything she had hoped for lies in ruins around her. The man who had promised to prepare a place for them in his Father's house is gone, and with him all the dreams and promises that had sustained her through the darkest nights. The sun climbs higher in the sky, but Mary remains beside the tomb, her vigil unbroken. She has nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. The spices she had brought lie scattered on the ground, their fragrance mixing with the scent of the garden flowers. It seems fitting somehow, beauty and sorrow intertwined, life and death dancing together in the morning light. As she weeps, Mary becomes aware of a presence behind her. She turns, expecting to see one of the other women returning, but instead she sees a figure she doesn't recognize. He is dressed as a gardener, his clothes simple and practical, his face kind but unfamiliar. Perhaps he has seen what happened to Jesus' body. Perhaps he knows who has taken it. "Woman, why are you weeping?" the stranger asks, his voice gentle and filled with compassion. "Who is it you are looking for?" Mary wipes her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to compose herself enough to speak. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." The words come out in a rush, desperate and pleading. She will do anything, go anywhere, pay any price to recover the body of her beloved teacher. The stranger takes a step closer, and something in his movement seems familiar, though Mary cannot place it. Her vision is blurred with tears, her mind clouded with grief, and she cannot think clearly enough to understand what her heart is trying to tell her. All she knows is that she must find Jesus' body, must ensure that he receives the proper burial that was denied him in the rush to beat the Sabbath. "Mary," the stranger says, and suddenly her world turns upside down. That voice, that inflection, that particular way of speaking her name that no one else has ever matched. Mary's head snaps up, her eyes clearing as she focuses on the figure before her. It cannot be. It is impossible. Yet there he stands, no longer a stranger but the most familiar person in all the world. The man she watched die on Friday afternoon is standing before her, alive and whole, and speaking her name with the same love and tenderness she remembers. Rabboni! The word tears from her throat like a cry of joy and disbelief. She reaches toward him, desperate to touch him, to confirm that he is real and not some cruel trick of her grief-stricken mind. But he steps back, his hand raised in a gesture that is both gentle and firm. "Do not hold on to me," he says, his voice filled with compassion and understanding. "For I have not yet ascended to my Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary's mind reels as she tries to process what she is seeing, what she is hearing. The man who had died on the cross stands before her, transformed but unmistakably himself. The wounds in his hands and feet are still visible, but they no longer speak of defeat. They proclaim victory. Death has been conquered. The grave has been defeated, and the impossible has become reality. The commission he gives her fills Mary with a purpose greater than any she has ever known. She is to be the first herald of the resurrection, the first to proclaim the greatest news in human history. The woman who had once been possessed by 7 demons will now be possessed by joy so profound it will transform not just her own life but the lives of everyone who hears her testimony. Mary runs toward Jerusalem, her feet barely touching the ground as she flies through the garden and into the streets beyond. The burial spices lie forgotten beside the empty tomb, no longer needed for their intended purpose. The man who had seemed lost forever has returned, not as a memory or a ghost, but as the living Lord who has defeated death itself. The disciples are still gathered in the upper room when Mary arrives, their faces etched with grief and confusion. The door is locked, barred against the authorities who might come for them next. But Mary's knocking is so urgent, so insistent, that they finally open it to see what has caused such commotion. "I have seen the Lord," Mary announces, her voice ringing with joy and wonder. "He is alive. He spoke to me in the garden." The silence that follows is deafening. The disciples stare at her as if she has lost her mind, their faces reflecting disbelief and skepticism. These are the same men who had followed Jesus for 3 years, who had witnessed his miracles and heard his teachings. Yet the news of his resurrection strikes them as impossible, too good to be true. Mary sees their doubt, understands their hesitation. She too had struggled to believe what her eyes had shown her. But she cannot deny what she has experienced, cannot dismiss the reality of the living Christ who had spoken her name with such love and authority. The truth burns within her like a flame that cannot be extinguished. "He told me to tell you that he is ascending to his Father and your Father, to his God and your God," Mary continues, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to share everything she has heard. "The tomb is empty because he is not there. He has risen just as he said he would." Some of the disciples exchange glances, their expressions revealing the battle between hope and disbelief that rages in their hearts. They want to believe, desperately want to accept that their beloved teacher has somehow triumphed over death. But the evidence of their senses, the reality of what they witnessed on Friday, makes such faith seem impossible. Mary's testimony becomes the first crack in the wall of their despair. Though they cannot yet fully accept what she is telling them, her joy is infectious, her certainty compelling. The woman who had wept beside the empty tomb now radiates a happiness so profound it seems to light up the dark room where they have been hiding. As the day progresses, other witnesses begin to arrive. The women who had accompanied Mary to the tomb share their own encounters with angels who proclaimed Jesus' resurrection. The guards who had been stationed at the tomb appear, their faces pale with fear as they report supernatural events that defy explanation. Each testimony adds weight to Mary's initial proclamation, building a case that becomes harder and harder to dismiss. Yet it is Mary's witness that remains at the center of it all. She was the first to see, the first to hear, the first to believe. The woman who had been chosen to receive the initial revelation of Jesus' resurrection becomes the foundation upon which all other testimonies rest. Her transformation from mourning to joy, from despair to hope, becomes a living demonstration of the power of Christ's victory over death. The disciples who had once dismissed her words as idle tales will soon have their own encounters with the risen Lord. They will see the wounds in his hands and side, hear his voice speaking words of peace and forgiveness. They will eat with him, walk with him, and learn from him in ways that will transform their understanding of everything they thought they knew about life and death. But Mary will always hold the unique distinction of being the first to see the empty tomb, the first to encounter the risen Christ, the first to proclaim the resurrection to the world. Her testimony becomes the first thread in the tapestry of faith that will spread across the globe, touching lives and changing hearts for generations to come. As evening approaches and the Sabbath draws to a close, Mary finds herself back in the garden where it all began. The empty tomb stands as a monument to God's power over death, its dark entrance now a doorway to hope rather than despair. The burial spices she had brought that morning lie scattered on the ground, their purpose forever changed by the miracle she has witnessed. The woman who had once been bound by 7 demons now walks in the freedom of knowing that death itself has been conquered. The teacher who had transformed her life has proven that love is indeed stronger than death, that hope can triumph over despair, that the story that seemed to end in tragedy has actually reached its greatest victory. As you drift toward sleep, carried along by the peaceful rhythm of your breathing, remember Mary Magdalene's journey from darkness to light, from despair to joy. Remember that the same God who freed her from demons and revealed his risen Son to her eyes is the same God who watches over you tonight. The woman who wept at the empty tomb became the first evangelist, the first to proclaim the good news that changes everything. Let Mary's story remind you that no night is so dark that dawn cannot break through. No sorrow so deep that joy cannot overcome it. No death so final that resurrection cannot conquer it. The empty tomb stands as an eternal promise that love wins in the end, that hope is never misplaced, and that the God who raised Jesus from the dead is the same God who holds you in his loving hands tonight. Sleep now in the peace of knowing that your own story is being written by the same loving hand that guided Mary Magdalene through her darkest hours to her brightest dawn. Rest in the assurance that the Christ who appeared to her in the garden still appears to hearts that seek him, still speaks names with the same tender love, still transforms lives with the same miraculous power. The gentle breeze that stirred the garden on that first Easter morning still carries the fragrance of hope across the centuries. It whispers of empty tombs and risen saviors, of women who weep at dawn and dance by evening, of love that conquers death and light that overcomes darkness. In that whisper, find your rest, knowing that the same God who made Mary Magdalene the first witness to the greatest miracle in history is the same God who watches over your sleep tonight. The morning sun climbs higher over Jerusalem as Mary Magdalene makes her way through the city streets, her heart still racing from the encounter in the garden. Your breathing has settled into the peaceful rhythm of approaching sleep as we follow her footsteps through this most extraordinary of days. The woman who had wept at the empty tomb now carries within her the most incredible news in human history. Yet she knows that convincing others will be no simple task. The disciples' initial reaction to Mary's testimony reveals the profound challenge she faces. These men who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had witnessed his miracles and heard his teachings, struggle to accept what seems impossible. Their doubt is not born of malice but of human nature itself. The natural resistance to believing that death, the ultimate enemy, has been defeated by the very person they watched die just 3 days before. Mary understands their skepticism because she herself had struggled to believe what her eyes had shown her. The transition from seeing Jesus as a gardener to recognizing him as the risen Lord had happened in an instant. Yet the implications would take a lifetime to fully comprehend. She had touched the edge of eternity in that garden moment, witnessed the impossible become reality, and now she must find words to convey what defies all human understanding. The other women who had accompanied her to the tomb begin to share their own experiences. They speak of angels with faces like lightning, of voices that proclaim Jesus' resurrection with authority that made the earth tremble beneath their feet. Each testimony adds another layer to the incredible story that is unfolding, yet Mary's remains the foundation upon which all others rest. She was the first to see, the first to hear, the first to believe. Throughout the day, Mary finds herself returning again and again to that moment when Jesus spoke her name. The sound of it echoes in her memory like the most beautiful music ever composed, a melody that transforms everything it touches. In that single word, she had heard forgiveness for her doubts, validation for her faithfulness, and commissioning for her future ministry. The woman who had once been identified by her afflictions was now known by her calling. The transformation that takes place in Mary's understanding goes far beyond the simple fact of Jesus' resurrection. She begins to see connections between his teachings and his triumph over death, patterns that had been hidden from her before, the parables about seeds dying to produce life, the promises about preparing a place for his followers, the assurances that death was not the end. All of these take on new meaning in the light of the empty tomb. Mary's role as the first witness places her in a unique position within the early Christian community. She becomes the bridge between the old understanding and the new reality, the one who can testify to both the finality of Jesus' death and the certainty of his resurrection. Her testimony carries special weight because she had been present at both events, had witnessed the full scope of God's redemptive plan from crucifixion to resurrection. The commission Jesus gave her in the garden, to go and tell his brothers about his ascension to the Father, transforms Mary from a follower into a leader, from a recipient of ministry into a minister herself. The woman who had once been possessed by 7 demons now possesses the most important message in human history. Her transformation illustrates the radical nature of God's grace, the way divine love can take the most broken vessels and use them for the most glorious purposes. As the news of Jesus' resurrection begins to spread through Jerusalem, Mary finds herself at the center of a growing movement. People come to her seeking details, wanting to hear firsthand about her encounter with the risen Christ. Some believe immediately, their hearts prepared by years of longing for just such a miracle. Others remain skeptical, demanding more proof than one woman's testimony can provide. Mary learns to be patient with both groups, understanding that faith comes in its own time and way. The religious authorities who had orchestrated Jesus' crucifixion react with alarm to reports of his resurrection. They had thought they had solved the problem of this troublesome teacher, but now his followers are more emboldened than ever. The empty tomb becomes a symbol of their failure to silence the message of love and forgiveness that Jesus had proclaimed. Mary's testimony threatens to undo everything they thought they had accomplished on that Friday afternoon. Mary's newfound role as proclaimer of the resurrection brings both joy and responsibility. She must learn to articulate experiences that transcend human language, to convey truths that challenge the very foundations of human understanding. The woman who had once been silenced by her afflictions now becomes one of the most important voices in the early church, her words carrying the authority of personal encounter with the risen Lord. The community that forms around the resurrection testimony becomes Mary's new family. The disciples who had initially doubted her words gradually come to understand the truth of what she had witnessed. They gather regularly to share their own encounters with the risen Christ, to study the scriptures in light of these new revelations, and to support one another in their growing faith. Mary's presence in this community provides continuity with Jesus' earthly ministry while pointing toward the new reality of his resurrection life. The practical implications of Jesus' resurrection begin to dawn on Mary as the days pass. This is not simply a miraculous event to be celebrated, but a cosmic shift that changes everything about how life is to be lived. Death no longer has the final word, suffering is no longer meaningless, and hope is no longer a fragile thing that can be crushed by circumstances. The empty tomb becomes a symbol of God's ultimate victory over all the forces that seek to destroy human flourishing. Mary's understanding of her own identity undergoes a profound transformation in light of the resurrection. She had been defined first by her possession by 7 demons, then by her healing and subsequent discipleship. Now she sees herself as a witness to the greatest miracle in human history, a role that will shape the rest of her life. The woman who had once been an outcast because of her afflictions becomes a central figure in the most important story ever told. The resurrection also transforms Mary's understanding of suffering and loss. The agony she had experienced watching Jesus die on the cross now takes on new meaning as she realizes it was not the end of the story but a necessary chapter in God's plan of redemption. Her tears at the foot of the cross had been tears of genuine grief, but they were also tears that watered the ground from which the greatest joy would spring. Mary's relationship with the other women who had followed Jesus deepens as they process together the implications of what they have witnessed. They had been bound together by their common devotion to Jesus during his earthly ministry. But now they are united by their shared experience of the resurrection. Their testimonies complement and strengthen each other, creating a network of witnesses that will prove crucial in the early days of the Christian Church. The courage that Mary displays in proclaiming the resurrection in the face of skepticism and opposition reveals the depth of her transformation. The woman who had once been tormented by demons now stands fearlessly before those who would silence her testimony. Her boldness comes not from natural temperament, but from the unshakable conviction that comes from personal encounter with the risen Christ. Mary's ministry extends beyond simply telling people about the resurrection. She becomes a counselor and encourager to those who are struggling with their own faith, using her experience of God's transforming power to help others find hope in their darkest moments. Her unique perspective as someone who had experienced both spiritual bondage and divine liberation gives her words special authority when she speaks to others who are suffering. The theological implications of Mary's testimony begin to emerge as the early church grapples with the meaning of Jesus' resurrection. Her witness becomes foundational to the developing understanding of Jesus as both fully human and fully divine, as the one who could die a real death and rise to real life. The garden encounter provides crucial evidence for the physical reality of the resurrection, countering early attempts to spiritualize away the miracle. Mary's role as the first witness also challenges prevailing assumptions about gender and spiritual authority. In a culture where women's testimony was often discounted, God chose a woman to be the first herald of the resurrection. This choice reveals something important about the nature of God's kingdom, where the first shall be last and the last shall be first, where the humble are exalted and the mighty are brought low. The ripple effects of Mary's testimony continue to spread throughout Jerusalem and beyond. Her story becomes part of the larger narrative of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that will be told and retold for generations. The woman who had once been known primarily for her afflictions becomes known for her faithfulness, her courage, and her unique role in the greatest story ever told. As evening approaches on that first Easter Sunday, Mary finds herself once again in quiet contemplation of all that has transpired. The day that began with tears at an empty tomb has ended with joy that seems almost too great to contain. The woman who had gone to anoint a dead body has instead encountered the living Lord, and nothing will ever be the same again. The transformation that has taken place in Mary's life serves as a preview of the transformation that the resurrection will bring to all who believe. Just as she had been changed from a woman possessed by demons to a devoted disciple, and then from a grieving mourner to a joyful witness, so all who encounter the risen Christ will find their lives radically altered by the experience. Mary's story reminds us that God delights in using the most unlikely people for his most important purposes. The woman who had once been considered unclean and untouchable became the first person entrusted with the news of Jesus' resurrection. Her journey from the margins of society to the center of God's redemptive plan illustrates the radical nature of divine grace and the way God's love can transform any life. The garden where Mary encountered the risen Jesus becomes a symbol of new creation, a place where death gives way to life, where sorrow is transformed into joy, where the impossible becomes reality. In that garden, the curse of Eden was reversed. The power of death was broken, and the promise of eternal life was secured for all who would believe. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let Mary Magdalene's story fill your heart with the same hope that filled hers on that first Easter morning. Remember that the same God who freed her from 7 demons and revealed his risen Son to her eyes is the same God who watches over you with love that knows no bounds. The woman who wept at the empty tomb became the first evangelist because she was willing to believe what seemed impossible and to share that belief with others. Let the gentle rhythm of your breathing carry you into peaceful rest, knowing that the story of Mary Magdalene is also your story. A story of transformation, of hope, of love that conquers all. The empty tomb stands as an eternal promise that no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn of God's love is always breaking through. Sleep now in the peace of knowing that the same resurrection power that transformed Mary's life is available to transform yours as well. The golden afternoon sun filters through the windows of the upper room as Mary Magdalene gathers with the other disciples, her heart still overflowing with the wonder of her garden encounter. Your breathing grows deeper and more peaceful as we witness these precious hours when the reality of the resurrection begins to take root in hearts that had been shattered by grief just days before. The disciples who had initially dismissed Mary's testimony as the ravings of a grief-stricken woman now find themselves grappling with mounting evidence that the impossible has indeed occurred. Thomas, who had been absent during Jesus' first appearance to the group, voices the skepticism that still lingers in some hearts. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe, he declares, his words carrying the weight of a man who has been hurt too deeply to risk hoping again. Mary understands Thomas's doubt because she remembers her own struggle to believe what her eyes had shown her in the garden. The transition from despair to joy had been so sudden, so complete, that even she sometimes wondered if it had all been a beautiful dream. But then she would remember the sound of Jesus speaking her name, the familiar inflection that no impostor could duplicate, and her certainty would return like the rising sun. The other women who had accompanied Mary to the tomb share their own pieces of the resurrection puzzle. They speak of angels whose appearance was like lightning, of voices that proclaimed Jesus' victory over death with authority that made the very ground beneath their feet tremble. Each testimony adds another thread to the tapestry of truth that is being woven before their eyes, creating a picture so magnificent that human minds struggle to comprehend its full beauty. As the days pass, Mary finds herself becoming a teacher and encourager to those who are struggling to understand what has happened. The woman who had once sat at Jesus' feet as a student now finds herself helping others grasp the profound implications of his resurrection. Her unique perspective as someone who had witnessed both the crucifixion and the resurrection gives her words special weight when she speaks about the continuity between Jesus' earthly ministry and his risen life. The transformation in Mary's understanding goes far beyond the simple fact that Jesus is alive. She begins to see how his death and resurrection fulfill all the promises he had made during his earthly ministry. The parables about seeds that must die to produce life, the teachings about laying down one's life to find it, the assurances that death was not the end. All of these take on new depth and meaning in light of the empty tomb. Mary's role as the first witness places her in a unique position within the growing Christian community. She becomes the living link between the Old Covenant and the New, between the age of promise and the age of fulfillment. Her testimony carries special authority because she can speak not only of Jesus' teachings, but of his triumph over the grave, not only of his love, but of his power to conquer death itself. The commission Jesus had given her in the garden to tell his brothers about his ascension to the Father transforms Mary from a follower into a leader, from a recipient of ministry into a minister herself. The woman who had once been known primarily for her afflictions is now known for her calling. Her identity forever changed by that moment when the risen Lord spoke her name with such tender love. As news of the resurrection spreads through Jerusalem, Mary finds herself at the center of a growing movement that will eventually transform the world. People come to her seeking details about her encounter with the risen Christ, hungering for hope in a world that has offered them little reason to believe in anything beyond the grave. Some accept her testimony immediately, their hearts prepared by years of longing for just such a miracle. Others remain skeptical, demanding more proof than one woman's word can provide. Mary learns to be patient with both groups, understanding that faith comes in its own time and way. She remembers how she herself had struggled to recognize Jesus in the garden, how her grief had clouded her vision until he spoke her name. If she, who had walked with him for years, could fail to recognize him at first, how much more difficult must it be for those who had never known him personally? The religious authorities who had orchestrated Jesus' crucifixion react with alarm to reports of his resurrection. They had thought they had solved the problem of this troublesome teacher, but now his followers are more emboldened than ever. The empty tomb becomes a symbol of their failure to silence the message of love and forgiveness that Jesus had proclaimed. Mary's testimony threatens to undo everything they thought they had accomplished on that dark Friday afternoon. Guards are questioned, bribes are offered, and alternative explanations are hastily constructed. But nothing can change the fundamental fact that confronts them. The tomb is empty, and Jesus' followers are transformed from a scattered band of frightened disciples into bold proclaimers of resurrection hope. Mary's witness stands at the center of this transformation, her joy infectious and her certainty unshakable. The practical implications of Jesus' resurrection begin to dawn on Mary as the weeks pass. This is not simply a miraculous event to be celebrated. but a cosmic shift that changes everything about how life is to be lived. Death no longer has the final word, suffering is no longer meaningless, and hope is no longer a fragile thing that can be crushed by circumstances. The empty tomb becomes a symbol of God's ultimate victory over all the forces that seek to destroy human flourishing. Mary's understanding of her own identity undergoes a profound transformation in light of the resurrection. She had been defined first by her possession by 7 demons, then by her healing and subsequent discipleship. Now she sees herself as a witness to the greatest miracle in human history, a role that will shape the rest of her life and influence countless generations to come. The resurrection also transforms Mary's understanding of suffering and loss. The agony she had experienced watching Jesus die on the cross now takes on new meaning as she realizes it was not the end of the story, but a necessary chapter in God's plan of redemption. Her tears at the foot of the cross had been tears of genuine grief, but they were also tears that watered the ground from which the greatest joy would spring. Mary's relationship with the other women who had followed Jesus deepens as they process together the implications of what they have witnessed. They had been bound together by their common devotion to Jesus during his earthly ministry. But now they are united by their shared experience of the resurrection. Their testimonies complement and strengthen each other, creating a network of witnesses that will prove crucial in the early days of the Christian Church. The courage that Mary displays in proclaiming the resurrection in the face of skepticism and opposition reveals the depth of her transformation. The woman who had once been tormented by demons now stands fearlessly before those who would silence her testimony. Her boldness comes not from natural temperament, but from the unshakable conviction that comes from personal encounter with the risen Christ. Mary's ministry extends beyond simply telling people about the resurrection. She becomes a counselor and encourager to those who are struggling with their own faith, using her experience of God's transforming power to help others find hope in their darkest moments. Her unique perspective as someone who had experienced both spiritual bondage and divine liberation gives her words special authority when she speaks to others who are suffering. The theological implications of Mary's testimony begin to emerge as the early church grapples with the meaning of Jesus' resurrection. Her witness becomes foundational to the developing understanding of Jesus as both fully human and fully divine, as the one who could die a real death and rise to real life. The garden encounter provides crucial evidence for the physical reality of the resurrection, countering early attempts to spiritualize away the miracle. Mary's role as the first witness also challenges prevailing assumptions about gender and spiritual authority. In a culture where women's testimony was often discounted, God chose a woman to be the first herald of the resurrection. This choice reveals something important about the nature of God's kingdom, where the first shall be last, and the last shall be first, where the humble are exalted and the mighty are brought low. The ripple effects of Mary's testimony continue to spread throughout Jerusalem and beyond. Her story becomes part of the larger narrative of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that will be told and retold for generations. The woman who had once been known primarily for her afflictions becomes known for her faithfulness, her courage, and her unique role in the greatest story ever told. As the sun sets on another day in this transformed world, Mary finds herself once again in quiet contemplation of all that has transpired. The weeks that have passed since that first Easter morning have been filled with wonder upon wonder, as the reality of Jesus' resurrection continues to unfold in ways that exceed her wildest dreams. The woman who had gone to anoint a dead body has instead encountered the living Lord, and nothing will ever be the same again. The transformation that has taken place in Mary's life serves as a preview of the transformation that the resurrection will bring to all who believe. Just as she had been changed from a woman possessed by demons to a devoted disciple, and then from a grieving mourner to a joyful witness, so all who encounter the risen Christ will find their lives radically altered by the experience. Mary's story reminds us that God delights in using the most unlikely people for his most important purposes. The woman who had once been considered unclean and untouchable became the first person entrusted with the news of Jesus' resurrection. Her journey from the margins of society to the center of God's redemptive plan illustrates the radical nature of divine grace and the way God's love can transform any life. As the gentle evening breeze stirs the curtains of the upper room, Mary reflects on the mystery of divine timing. Why had she been chosen to be the first witness? Why had Jesus appeared to her before all others? The questions have no easy answers, but Mary has learned to trust in God's wisdom even when his ways remain mysterious. She knows that her calling is not to understand every detail of God's plan, but to faithfully proclaim what she has seen and heard. The community that has formed around the resurrection testimony becomes Mary's new family. The disciples who had initially doubted her words gradually come to understand the truth of what she had witnessed. They gather regularly to share their own encounters with the risen Christ, to study the scriptures in light of these new revelations, and to support one another in their growing faith. Mary's presence in this community provides continuity with Jesus' earthly ministry while pointing toward the new reality of his resurrection life. The garden where Mary encountered the risen Jesus becomes a symbol of new creation, a place where death gives way to life, where sorrow is transformed into joy, where the impossible becomes reality. In that garden, the curse of Eden was reversed, the power of death was broken, and the promise of eternal life was secured for all who would believe. Every time Mary passes that sacred spot, she remembers the moment when her world was turned upside down by the voice of love calling her name. As you drift deeper into peaceful sleep tonight, let Mary Magdalene's story fill your heart with the same hope that filled hers on that first Easter morning. Remember that the same God who freed her from 7 demons and revealed his risen Son to her eyes is the same God who watches over you with love that knows no bounds. The woman who wept at the empty tomb became the first evangelist because she was willing to believe what seemed impossible and to share that belief with others. Let the gentle rhythm of your breathing carry you into restful slumber, knowing that the story of Mary Magdalene is also your story, a story of transformation, of hope, of love that conquers all. The empty tomb stands as an eternal promise that no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn of God's love is always breaking through. Sleep now in the peace of knowing that the same resurrection power that transformed Mary's life is available to transform yours as well. The soft whisper of wind through the olive trees carries you toward dreams of garden encounters and empty tombs, of voices that speak your name with infinite tenderness, of hope that refuses to be silenced by any darkness. In Mary's story, find your own story of redemption, your own encounter with the God who specializes in impossible things, your own transformation from whatever has bound you to the glorious freedom of resurrection life. The gentle morning light filters through the windows of Mary's simple dwelling as she prepares for another day of sharing the greatest news ever proclaimed. Your breathing settles into the peaceful rhythm of approaching rest as we witness how the woman who first announced the resurrection continues to live out her calling in the growing Christian community. Mary's days have taken on a new pattern since that transformative morning in the garden. Each dawn brings fresh opportunities to share her testimony, to encourage those whose faith wavers, and to nurture the small but growing community of believers who gather regularly to remember Jesus' teachings and celebrate his triumph over death. The woman who had once been isolated by her afflictions now finds herself at the heart of a fellowship that transcends all social boundaries. The house where the disciples meet has become a sanctuary of hope in a world still reeling from the shock of the crucifixion and resurrection. Mary often arrives early, helping to prepare the simple meal that they share in remembrance of Jesus' words about his body and blood. Her hands, which had once trembled with the effects of demonic possession, now move with steady purpose as she breaks bread and pours wine, each action a reminder of the love that had transformed her life. As believers gather in the lamplight of evening, Mary finds herself naturally taking on the role of teacher and encourager. Those who are new to the faith hunger for details about Jesus' earthly ministry, wanting to know what he was like as a person, how he interacted with his followers, what gave him joy or moved him to tears. Mary's memories become treasures that she shares generously, painting pictures of the man who had walked among them with such grace and power. The stories she tells are intimate and personal, drawn from the countless hours she had spent in Jesus' presence. She speaks of the way his eyes would light up when children ran to him, of the gentle patience he showed when teaching difficult concepts, of the righteous anger that flashed across his face when he witnessed injustice or hypocrisy. These glimpses into Jesus' humanity help new believers understand that the risen Lord they worship was also fully human, someone who had experienced the full range of human emotions and experiences. Mary's testimony about the resurrection never grows old or routine. Each time she tells the story of that morning in the garden, she discovers new depths of meaning, new reasons for wonder and praise. The sound of Jesus speaking her name continues to echo in her memory like the most beautiful music, a melody that grows richer with each remembering. She learns to read her audiences, adapting her words to meet them where they are in their journey of faith. Some who come to hear Mary's story are skeptics, drawn by curiosity rather than belief. They ask probing questions, challenge details, demand proof that goes beyond one woman's testimony. Mary has learned to be patient with such inquiries, remembering her own initial struggle to believe what her eyes had shown her. She answers their questions with gentleness and humility, never claiming to understand everything about the mystery of the resurrection, but always affirming what she knows to be true. Jesus is alive and he has conquered death. Others who seek Mary out are believers who are struggling with doubt or facing their own trials. They come to her because they know she understands what it means to be transformed by divine grace, to experience healing that goes beyond the physical, to touch the very core of one's being. Mary's presence offers them hope that if God could free her from 7 demons and use her for such a glorious purpose, he can surely work in their lives as well. The practical aspects of building a new community of faith require Mary's attention and gifts. She helps organize the care of widows and orphans, coordinates the sharing of resources among believers, and provides counsel to those facing family conflicts over their new faith. Her experience of rejection and restoration gives her unique insight into the challenges faced by those who choose to follow Jesus in a hostile world. Mary's financial resources, which had once supported Jesus' earthly ministry, now help sustain the growing church. She continues to give generously, understanding that her wealth is not her own but a trust from God to be used for his purposes. Her example of sacrificial giving inspires others to share their own resources, creating a community where no one lacks for basic necessities. The opposition that Mary faces grows more intense as the Christian movement gains momentum. The religious authorities who had hoped that Jesus' crucifixion would end the problem of his influence now find themselves confronting a movement that is more vibrant and determined than ever. Mary's prominent role as the first witness to the resurrection makes her a particular target for their anger and frustration. Threats come in various forms: subtle warnings, economic pressure, social ostracism. Mary finds herself excluded from synagogue worship, shunned by former friends, and watched by those who would love to find some way to discredit her testimony. Yet she faces these challenges with a courage that surprises even herself, drawing strength from the memory of Jesus' voice calling her name and commissioning her to be his messenger. The other women who had followed Jesus remain Mary's closest companions and sources of mutual support. They understand each other's experiences in ways that others cannot, having shared the journey from discipleship through crucifixion to resurrection. Their bond deepens as they face opposition together, their testimonies complementing and strengthening each other in the face of skepticism and hostility. Mary's relationship with the male disciples continues to evolve, as they all adjust to the new reality of Jesus' resurrection and ascension. The initial skepticism that had greeted her testimony gradually gives way to acceptance and respect, as they witness the consistency of her character and the fruit of her ministry. Peter, who had once denied even knowing Jesus, becomes one of Mary's strongest supporters, understanding from his own experience the power of divine forgiveness and restoration. The theological implications of Mary's testimony continue to unfold as the early church grapples with questions about the nature of Jesus' resurrection body and the meaning of his victory over death. Her detailed account of the garden encounter provides crucial evidence for the physical reality of the resurrection, helping to counter early attempts to spiritualize away the miracle or reduce it to mere metaphor. Mary's role as a teacher expands as she begins to work with other women in the community, helping them understand their own calling and gifts. In a culture that often marginalized women's voices, the Christian community offers unprecedented opportunities for female leadership and ministry. Mary's example shows other women that God can use them in powerful ways regardless of their past or their social status. The healing ministry that Mary witnesses continues to flow through the apostles and other believers, serving as ongoing confirmation of Jesus' resurrection power. When she sees demons cast out or diseases healed in Jesus' name, Mary remembers her own deliverance and marvels at how God continues to work through his people. Each miracle serves as a reminder that the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is available to transform lives today. Mary's understanding of Scripture deepens as she studies the Hebrew texts in light of the resurrection. Prophecies that had seemed mysterious now shine with new clarity. Their fulfillment in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection providing powerful evidence for his identity as the promised Messiah. She delights in discovering these connections, seeing how God's plan had been unfolding through centuries of preparation. The missionary impulse that drives the early church finds expression in Mary's own ministry as she travels to nearby towns and villages to share her testimony. Her reputation as the first witness to the resurrection opens doors that might otherwise remain closed, and her gentle manner and obvious sincerity touch hearts that are hungry for hope. Each new believer becomes a source of joy that reminds her of her own transformation. The challenges of maintaining unity within the growing Christian community require Mary's diplomatic skills and spiritual wisdom. Disagreements arise over practical matters like the distribution of resources, theological questions about the requirements for Gentile converts, and personal conflicts between strong personalities. Mary's experience of God's grace helps her serve as a peacemaker, reminding others of the love that should characterize their relationships with one another. As the seasons change and the church continues to grow, Mary finds herself serving as a bridge between the original disciples and the newer converts who never knew Jesus personally. Her memories of his earthly ministry help newcomers understand the continuity between the Jesus who walked among them and the risen Christ they worship. Her testimony provides a living link to the historical reality of the Incarnation. The prayers that Mary offers for the church and its mission reflect her deep understanding of the spiritual warfare that surrounds their work. She knows from personal experience the reality of demonic opposition, but she also knows the greater reality of God's power to overcome every form of darkness. Her intercession becomes a source of strength for the entire community as they face the challenges of living out their faith in a hostile world. Mary's reflection on her own journey often fills her with wonder at the ways God has worked in her life. From the darkness of demonic possession to the light of resurrection witness, from social outcast to respected leader, from broken woman to healing minister, every step of her path reveals the transforming power of divine love. Her story becomes a testimony to the truth that God specializes in impossible things. The legacy that Mary is building extends far beyond her own lifetime. The believers she has taught and encouraged will carry the message of resurrection hope to future generations. The church she has helped establish will grow and spread throughout the Roman world and beyond. The testimony she has faithfully proclaimed will echo through the centuries, inspiring countless others to believe in the God who conquers death. As evening settles over Jerusalem and the oil lamps are lit in the house where believers gather, Mary takes her place among the community that has become her family. The woman who had once been isolated by her afflictions now finds herself surrounded by love and purpose. The one who had wept at an empty tomb now rejoices in the presence of the living Christ who continues to work through his people. The gentle rhythm of your breathing carries you deeper into peaceful rest as Mary's story continues to unfold in the growing Christian community. Her journey from possession to proclamation, from despair to joy, from isolation to leadership, serves as a reminder that God's love can transform any life and use any person for his glorious purposes. The woman who first announced the resurrection continues to live out its implications, showing the world what it means to be truly alive in Christ. Sleep now in the peace of knowing that the same God who called Mary by name in the garden calls you by name tonight. Rest in the assurance that the same resurrection power that transformed her life is available to transform yours. Let her story remind you that no past is too dark, no present too difficult, no future too uncertain for the God who specializes in resurrection miracles. The empty tomb stands as an eternal promise that love wins in the end, and Mary Magdalene's life stands as proof that this promise is true. The soft evening breeze carries the scent of jasmine through the open windows as Mary Magdalene settles into her evening prayers, her heart still overflowing with gratitude for the miraculous transformation that continues to unfold in her life. Your eyelids grow heavy as we witness these tender moments when the first herald of the resurrection finds solace in communion with the God who has made all things new. The years that have passed since that first Easter morning have only deepened Mary's appreciation for the magnitude of what she witnessed in the garden. Each sunset brings fresh wonder at the reality that death has been conquered, that hope has triumphed over despair, that the impossible has become the foundation of everything she believes. The woman who had once been tormented by 7 demons now lives in the constant awareness of divine presence, her life a living testament to the power of resurrection love. The Christian community that has grown around Mary's testimony continues to flourish, despite increasing persecution from both religious and political authorities. The believers who gather in homes throughout Jerusalem and beyond find in her story a source of unshakable hope that sustains them through their own trials. Her presence among them serves as a reminder that the same God who freed her from spiritual bondage can deliver them from whatever threatens their peace. Mary's role as a teacher and mentor has expanded as more women join the growing movement. She works patiently with those who struggle to understand their worth and calling, helping them see that God's love extends equally to all who seek Him. Her own journey from outcast to apostle provides powerful evidence that divine grace recognizes no social boundaries, no gender limitations, no past too dark for redemption. The practical challenges of maintaining a thriving faith community require Mary's continued attention and wisdom. She helps coordinate the care of those in need, organizes the sharing of resources, and provides counsel to families facing persecution for their beliefs. Her financial contributions, drawn from her own resources and the generosity of other believers, help sustain missionaries who carry the gospel message to distant lands. The opposition that Mary faces has evolved from skepticism to active hostility as the Christian movement gains influence throughout the Roman world. The religious authorities who had hoped that Jesus' crucifixion would end their problems now find themselves confronting a faith that grows stronger with each passing year. Mary's prominence as the first witness to the resurrection makes her a particular target for their anger and frustration. Yet Mary meets each challenge with the same courage that had enabled her to remain at the cross when others fled. Her strength comes not from natural bravery, but from the unshakable conviction that flows from personal encounter with the risen Christ. The voice that had called her name in the garden continues to whisper words of encouragement during her darkest moments, reminding her that she is loved, chosen, and empowered for this calling. The theological questions that arise as the Church grapples with the implications of Jesus' resurrection find in Mary a knowledgeable and thoughtful contributor. Her first-hand experience of the garden encounter provides crucial insights into the nature of the risen body, the continuity between Jesus' earthly and resurrection life, and the reality of his victory over death. Her testimony helps counter early attempts to reduce the resurrection to mere metaphor or spiritual symbolism. Mary's ministry extends beyond the borders of Jerusalem as she travels to neighboring towns and villages, sharing her testimony with those who hunger for hope. Her reputation as the first witness to the resurrection opens doors that might otherwise remain closed, and her gentle manner and obvious sincerity touch hearts that are weary from life's burdens. Each new believer becomes a source of joy that reminds her of her own transformation. The healing ministry that continues to flow through the apostles and other believers serves as ongoing confirmation of Jesus' resurrection power. When Mary witnesses demons cast out or diseases healed in Jesus' name, she remembers her own deliverance and marvels at how God continues to work through his people. Each miracle serves as a reminder that the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is available to transform lives today. The scriptures take on new depth and meaning as Mary studies them in light of the resurrection. Prophecies that had seemed mysterious now shine with clarity, their fulfillment in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection providing powerful evidence for his identity as the promised Messiah. She delights in sharing these discoveries with others, helping them see the golden thread of God's redemptive plan woven throughout the Hebrew texts. Mary's understanding of prayer deepens as she learns to commune with the risen Christ who lives forever to intercede for his people. Her conversations with God become more intimate and confident, reflecting the security that comes from knowing she is loved unconditionally. The woman who had once been silenced by her afflictions now finds her voice in prayer, interceding for the church, for those who persecute them, and for the spread of the gospel message. The relationships that Mary has built within the Christian community provide her with a network of support and encouragement that sustains her through difficult times. The other women who had followed Jesus remain her closest companions, their shared experiences creating bonds that transcend ordinary friendship. Together they face opposition, celebrate victories, and support one another in their continuing ministry. Mary's influence on the development of Christian worship practices reflects her deep understanding of the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection. She helps establish traditions that commemorate the empty tomb, that celebrate the victory over death, and that remind believers of their own hope of resurrection. Her insights into the meaning of the bread and wine, drawn from her memories of Jesus' teachings, help shape the communal meals that become central to Christian fellowship. The courage that Mary displays in the face of increasing persecution inspires others to remain faithful despite the cost. Her willingness to speak boldly about her encounter with the risen Christ, even when threatened with imprisonment or death, demonstrates the transforming power of resurrection faith. The woman who had once been bound by demons now lives in complete freedom, unafraid of any earthly authority that might seek to silence her testimony. Mary's role as a counselor and spiritual advisor grows as more people seek her guidance in matters of faith and practice. Her experience of God's transforming power gives her unique insight into the struggles faced by those who are seeking to follow Christ in a hostile world. She offers practical wisdom about living out one's faith in daily life, drawing from her own journey of transformation to provide hope and encouragement to others. The missionary vision that drives the early church finds expression in Mary's own ministry, as she supports and encourages those who carry the gospel message to distant lands. Her prayers and financial contributions help sustain evangelists who face dangers and hardships in their efforts to share the good news. Each report of new believers won to Christ fills her with joy and reminds her of the global scope of God's redemptive plan. The theological training that Mary provides to other women in the community helps prepare them for their own ministries of teaching and encouragement. Her deep knowledge of Jesus' teachings, combined with her understanding of the resurrection's implications, makes her an invaluable resource for those who seek to grow in their faith. The woman who had once been excluded from religious education now becomes a teacher who opens the scriptures to others. Mary's reflection on her own journey often fills her with amazement at the ways God has worked in her life. From the darkness of demonic possession to the light of resurrection witness, from social outcast to respected leader, from broken woman to healing minister. Every step of her path reveals the transforming power of divine love. Her story becomes a living testimony to the truth that God specializes in impossible things. The legacy that Mary is building extends far beyond her own lifetime. The believers she has taught and encouraged will carry the message of resurrection hope to future generations. The church she has helped establish will grow and spread throughout the Roman world and beyond. The testimony she has faithfully proclaimed will echo through the centuries, inspiring countless others to believe in the God who conquers death. As the stars appear in the darkening sky above Jerusalem, Mary concludes her evening prayers with words of gratitude for the privilege of serving as the first herald of the resurrection. The woman who had wept at an empty tomb now rejoices in the presence of the living Christ, who continues to work through his people. Her life stands as proof that no past is too dark, no present too difficult, no future too uncertain for the God who specializes in resurrection miracles. The gentle rhythm of your breathing carries you deeper into peaceful rest as Mary's story continues to unfold in the growing Christian community. Her journey from possession to proclamation, from despair to joy, from isolation to leadership, serves as a reminder that God's love can transform any life and use any person for His glorious purposes. The woman who first announced the resurrection continues to live out its implications, showing the world what it means to be truly alive in Christ. Sleep now in the peace of knowing that the same God who called Mary by name in the garden calls you by name tonight. Rest in the assurance that the same resurrection power that transformed her life is available to transform yours. Let her story remind you that the empty tomb stands as an eternal promise that love wins in the end, and that Mary Magdalene's life stands as proof that this promise is true for all who believe. The soft whisper of wind through the olive trees carries you toward dreams, filled with the hope of resurrection morning, where voices call your name with infinite tenderness, where empty tombs proclaim victory over death, and where broken lives are made whole by the power of divine love. In Mary's continuing story, find your own story of redemption and transformation, knowing that the same God who chose her to be the first herald of the greatest news ever proclaimed continues to work miracles in the lives of all who trust in Him. The gentle whisper of dawn carries Mary Magdalene's story toward its eternal conclusion as she rests in the final chapters of her earthly journey. Your breathing has found its deepest rhythm now, matching the peaceful cadence of a life lived in complete surrender to the risen Christ who had called her by name in that garden so many years ago. The woman who had once been tormented by 7 demons now lies surrounded by the love of the community she had helped to build. Her weathered hands, which had once trembled with affliction but later steadied to serve the Lord, rest peacefully upon the simple blanket that covers her frail form. The eyes that had first beheld the risen Savior now look beyond the veil of this world toward the eternal home that Jesus had promised to prepare for all who believe. Mary's final days are filled with quiet reflection on the miraculous journey that had brought her from the depths of spiritual darkness to the heights of divine purpose. The believers who gather around her bedside represent the fruit of her faithful testimony. Men and women whose lives had been transformed by the same resurrection power that had first freed her from demonic bondage. Each face tells a story of redemption. Each heart bears witness to the enduring truth of Jesus' victory over death. The other women who had walked with Jesus during His earthly ministry take turns keeping vigil with their beloved sister. Joanna, whose husband had served in Herod's household, holds Mary's hand and whispers words of comfort drawn from their shared memories of following the Master. Susanna, faithful to the end, reads aloud from the scrolls that preserve Jesus' teachings, her voice carrying the same gentle cadence that had once soothed their fears during those uncertain days of early discipleship. As Mary's strength ebbs like the tide, her voice grows softer, but her testimony remains strong. Those who lean close to hear her final words receive not complaints about her suffering, but expressions of gratitude for the privilege of serving as the first herald of the resurrection. "I have seen the Lord," she whispers, the same words that had burst from her lips on that first Easter morning now serving as her final declaration of faith. The Christian community that has grown around Mary's testimony prepares to bid farewell to the woman who had bridged the gap between Jesus' earthly ministry and his resurrection glory. Her influence extends far beyond Jerusalem's walls, touching lives throughout the Roman world and beyond. The gospel message that she had been the first to proclaim continues to spread like ripples on a vast ocean, carrying hope to hearts that hunger for meaning and purpose. Mary's understanding of her own mortality is shaped by her unshakable faith in the resurrection she had witnessed. Death holds no terror for the woman who had seen Jesus conquer the grave, who had heard him speak of preparing a place for his followers in his Father's house. The tomb that awaits her earthly remains will be merely a temporary resting place, a brief pause before the ultimate reunion with the Lord she had served so faithfully. The prayers that rise from the gathered believers blend together in a symphony of gratitude and hope. They thank God for the privilege of knowing Mary, for the testimony she had shared, for the example she had set of what it means to live in the power of resurrection faith. Their tears of sorrow are mingled with tears of joy as they anticipate the glorious welcome that awaits her in the presence of the risen Christ. As the sun sets on Mary's final day, casting long shadows across the room where she lies surrounded by love, her breathing grows shallow and peaceful. The woman who had once been possessed by 7 demons now rests in the perfect peace that comes from knowing she is held in the arms of infinite love. Her journey from darkness to light, from despair to hope, from isolation to community draws to its earthly close. So, the moment of her passing is marked not by grief but by quiet celebration. Those who witness her final breath see not defeat but victory, not ending but beginning. Mary Magdalene, the first witness to the resurrection, has now become a witness to the truth of Jesus' promise that those who believe in him shall never die, but have eternal life. Her earthly ministry is complete, but her testimony will echo through the ages. The burial of Mary Magdalene becomes a celebration of resurrection hope rather than a ceremony of mourning. The believers who gather to lay her body to rest do so with the confident expectation that this is not goodbye, but until we meet again. The woman who had first proclaimed, "I have seen the Lord," now sees him face to face, no longer through the veil of mortality, but in the fullness of eternal glory. The legacy that Mary leaves behind extends far beyond her own lifetime. The church she helped establish will grow and flourish, carrying the message of resurrection hope to the ends of the earth. The believers she taught and encouraged will become teachers themselves, passing on the faith to future generations. The testimony she faithfully proclaimed will inspire countless others to believe in the God who conquers death and transforms lives. In the quiet hours after Mary's passing, those who loved her most gather to share their memories of the woman who had played such a crucial role in their spiritual journey. They speak of her gentleness with those who doubted, her courage in the face of persecution, her unwavering faith in the reality of the resurrection. Each story becomes a thread in the tapestry of remembrance that will preserve her influence for generations to come. The impact of Mary's life cannot be measured in earthly terms. She had been chosen by God to play a unique role in the greatest story ever told, serving as the bridge between Jesus' death and resurrection, between human despair and divine hope. Her transformation from a woman possessed by demons to the first herald of the resurrection stands as eternal proof that God's grace knows no limits, that His love can redeem any life, that His power can transform any situation. As the stars emerge in the darkening sky above Jerusalem, the believers who had known Mary begin to understand that her death is not an ending but a commencement. The woman who had first announced the resurrection has now experienced it herself, passing from this life into the eternal life that Jesus had promised to all who believe. Her earthly journey is complete, but her story continues in the lives of all who have been touched by her testimony. The gentle rhythm of your breathing carries you toward the deepest rest as Mary Magdalene's story finds its perfect conclusion in the arms of the risen Christ she had served so faithfully. Her life stands as a testament to the transforming power of divine love, a reminder that no past is too dark, no present too difficult, no future too uncertain for the God who specializes in resurrection miracles. Sleep now in the peace of knowing that Mary's story is also your story. A story of redemption and transformation, of love that conquers death and hope that transcends every circumstance. The woman who wept at an empty tomb and rejoiced at the sound of her name being called by the risen Lord has shown us all what it means to live in the power of resurrection faith. Her journey from darkness to light illuminates the path for all who seek to follow in her footsteps. The empty tomb stands as an eternal promise that love wins in the end, and Mary Magdalene's life stands as proof that this promise is true for all who believe. Rest in the assurance that the same God who called her by name in the garden calls you by name tonight. That the same resurrection power that transformed her life is available to transform yours. That the same hope that sustained her through every trial is yours to claim and cherish. In dreams filled with garden encounters and resurrection joy, with voices that speak your name with infinite tenderness and love that conquers every fear. Find your own place in the continuing story of God's redemptive grace. Mary Magdalene's legacy lives on in every heart that has been touched by the message she was the first to proclaim. Christ is risen. Death is defeated, and love has won the victory that changes everything forever.